In the rolling hills of ancient Macedonia, in the year 384 BCE, a child was born who would become the single most influential thinker in human history. Aristotle's impact on Western civilization cannot be overstated. For nearly 2,000 years, his word was treated as final authority on nearly every subject imaginable. His influence shaped medieval Christianity, Islamic philosophy, and the development of modern science. Even today, when we use words like category, essence, matter, form, potential, or actual, we are speaking Aristotle's language, thinking thoughts that he first articulated over 2 millennia ago. But Aristotle was not born into the philosophical elite. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician to the Macedonian king, which gave young Aristotle exposure to both practical scientific investigation and the corridors of political power. This dual inheritance, the empirical precision of medicine and the strategic thinking required in royal courts, would profoundly shape his philosophical method. Unlike earlier philosophers who sought truth through pure reason alone, Aristotle would insist that genuine knowledge required careful observation of the actual world. When Aristotle was 17, he traveled to Athens to study at Plato's Academy, the most prestigious intellectual institution in the Greek world. For 20 years, he remained Plato's student, absorbing the master's teachings about the eternal forms that exist beyond our physical reality. Plato taught that the visible world was merely a shadow of true reality, that mathematical and moral truths existed in a transcendent realm, accessible only through pure reason. The physical world, with all its change and imperfection, was for Plato a realm of mere appearance, an illusion. But even as the young Aristotle learned from Plato, he began to develop profound disagreements with his teacher. Where Plato saw the physical world as an inferior copy of eternal forms, Aristotle saw nature as the proper object of philosophical investigation. Where Plato emphasized mathematics and abstract reasoning, Aristotle insisted on the importance of observation and empirical study. Where Plato sought escape from the material world into pure contemplation, Aristotle wanted to understand this world in all its concrete particularity. The relationship between these two giants of philosophy was complex and deeply human. Aristotle revered Plato as his teacher and intellectual father, yet he could not accept doctrines that seemed to him fundamentally mistaken. Later writers would summarize this tension in a famous phrase: "Plato is dear to me, but truth is dearer still." This willingness to challenge even his most beloved teacher demonstrated the independence of mind that would characterize all of Aristotle's work. When Plato died in 347 BCE, Aristotle left Athens. Perhaps he was disappointed not to be chosen as Plato's successor at the Academy. Perhaps he simply needed distance to develop his own philosophical system, free from the shadow of his master. For several years he traveled and studied, particularly focusing on biology and natural history. This period of intense empirical observation would prove crucial to his intellectual development. In 343 BCE, Aristotle received an extraordinary invitation. Philip II of Macedon asked him to serve as tutor to his 13-year-old son, Alexander. For 3 years, Aristotle educated the young prince who would become Alexander the Great. What did Aristotle teach the future conqueror of the known world? We can only speculate, but we know that Alexander carried copies of Homer's Iliad throughout his campaigns, that he showed interest in natural philosophy and geography, and that he maintained correspondence with Aristotle even during his military expeditions. The relationship between philosopher and king demonstrated Aristotle's belief that theoretical wisdom should inform practical action. In 335 BCE, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. Here, free from the influence of Platonic doctrine, he could develop his own comprehensive philosophical system. The Lyceum became a center for scientific research, unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. Aristotle and his students collected specimens, conducted dissections, gathered historical and political information from around the Greek world, and systematically investigated nearly every subject of human knowledge. Aristotle's method at the Lyceum was distinctive. He would lecture while walking in the school's covered walkways, leading his students to nickname his followers peripatetics, meaning those who walk about. This physical movement while thinking symbolized his philosophical approach. Knowledge was not static contemplation of eternal truths, but an active engagement with changing reality. The scope of Aristotle's investigations was breathtaking. He wrote on logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics, psychology, biology, physics, astronomy, and meteorology. He essentially created several academic disciplines that had never existed before. His work on logic remained the standard treatment of the subject for over 2,000 years. His biological investigations identified and classified hundreds of species with remarkable accuracy. His ethical and political writings established frameworks for thinking about human flourishing that remain influential today. But Aristotle was not merely collecting information. He was developing a unified vision of reality, a comprehensive system that could explain everything from the movement of the stars to the growth of plants, to the structure of human societies, to the nature of God. This systematic ambition, the attempt to understand all of reality within a single coherent framework, became one of philosophy's defining aspirations for the next 2 millennia. At the heart of Aristotle's philosophy lies a deceptively simple question: what is being? What does it mean for something to exist? Previous philosophers had offered various answers. Some said reality was fundamentally material. Everything was made of atoms moving through void. Others insisted reality was fundamentally mental or spiritual. The physical world was illusion, and only ideas were real. Aristotle rejected both extremes and developed an account of reality that took seriously both the material and formal aspects of existence. Aristotle's approach began with careful observation of ordinary objects in the world around us. Consider a marble statue of a human being. What makes this statue what it is? We can identify several distinct factors. There is the marble itself, the material stuff from which the statue is composed. There is the shape or form of the statue, the specific arrangement that makes this chunk of marble represent a human figure rather than remaining an unformed block. There is the sculptor who carved it, the agent responsible for bringing the statue into existence. And there is the purpose for which it was made, perhaps to honor a god or commemorate a hero. From this simple analysis, Aristotle extracted a theory that would revolutionize metaphysics. He proposed that we can understand anything in terms of 4 causes: material cause, what it's made of; formal cause, what makes it the kind of thing it is; efficient cause, what brought it into existence; and final cause, what purpose it serves. This 4-cause analysis gave Aristotle a powerful tool for understanding not just artifacts like statues, but natural objects, living organisms, and even human actions. The material cause answers the question, what is this made from? For the statue, it's marble. For a house, it's bricks and wood. For a living organism, it's flesh and bone. Material cause represents the potential that can be shaped into various forms. The same marble could become a statue, a column, or remain an uncarved block. Matter represents possibility waiting to be actualized. The formal cause answers, what makes this thing what it is? What distinguishes this particular statue from other marble objects? It's the specific form or shape imposed on the matter. But, for Aristotle, form means much more than just physical shape. The form of something includes its essential characteristics, the properties that make it the kind of thing it is, rather than something else. The form of a human being includes not just physical shape, but rationality, the capacity for speech, and social nature. The efficient cause answers what brought this into existence. For the statue, it's the sculptor's action. For a child, it's the parents. For a plant, it's the seed. Efficient cause represents the process of change by which potential becomes actual. Aristotle was fascinated by processes of change and development, and efficient causation helped explain how things come into being. The final cause answers, what is this for? What purpose does it serve? The statue exists to honor a deity. A knife exists to cut. An eye exists to see. Final cause represents the goal or purpose toward which something tends. This was perhaps Aristotle's most controversial and influential idea, that nature itself operates purposefully, that things have inherent goals built into their very essence. This four-cause framework allowed Aristotle to give a rich account of natural processes. Consider an acorn growing into an oak tree. The material cause is the physical stuff of the acorn and the nutrients it absorbs. The formal cause is the structure and characteristics of oak trees, what makes an oak rather than a pine or a willow. The efficient cause includes the internal processes of growth and development triggered by moisture and warmth. And crucially, the final cause is the mature oak tree itself. The acorn has an inherent tendency to develop toward this goal. This last point was revolutionary and deeply controversial. Aristotle was claiming that natural objects have built-in purposes, that nature operates teleologically, oriented toward goals and ends. An acorn wants to become an oak, an eye aims at seeing, and human beings seek happiness and flourishing. This wasn't mystical anthropomorphism. Aristotle wasn't saying that acorns consciously desire anything. Rather, he was observing that natural processes appear to be directional and goal-oriented in ways that purely mechanical explanations cannot capture. Central to Aristotle's metaphysics is the distinction between potentiality and actuality. This pair of concepts represents his brilliant solution to ancient puzzles about change in being. Earlier philosophers had struggled to explain how change was even possible. If something changes, it becomes what it wasn't before. But how can something that doesn't exist come into existence? How can what is become what is not? Aristotle's answer was elegant. A thing can be potentially something without actually being it. The marble block is potentially a statue even before the sculptor begins work. The acorn is potentially an oak tree. A child is potentially a learned adult. Potential being is real being. It's not nothing, but it's not yet fully realized being. Change occurs when potential being becomes actual being, when what could be becomes what is. This framework of potency and act, as medieval philosophers would later call it, gave Aristotle powerful tools for analyzing all sorts of philosophical problems. It explained how learning was possible. The ignorant person is potentially knowledgeable. It explained biological development. The embryo is potentially a mature organism. It explains skill acquisition. The novice is potentially a master. In each case, change involves the actualization of potential that was already present, waiting to be realized. But Aristotle pushed his analysis further. If we had potential being, an actual being, which is more fundamental? His answer was unequivocal. Actuality is prior to potentiality. Potential exists only in relation to some actuality that it can become. We can't understand what an acorn potentially is unless we already understand what an actual oak tree is. The potential presupposes and points toward the actual. This principle, the priority of actuality over potentiality, had enormous consequences for Aristotle's entire philosophical system. It meant that explanation always proceeds from the actual to the potential, from what fully is to what could be. It meant that perfect, unchanging actuality must be more real than changeable, potential being. And ultimately, it led Aristotle to his conception of God as pure actuality, with no unrealized potential whatsoever. One of Aristotle's most striking and influential ideas was his vision of nature as a great hierarchy or ladder of being, stretching from the simplest matter to the highest forms of life and thought. This wasn't merely a classification scheme. It reflected Aristotle's deep conviction that reality itself is organized according to levels of perfection, with each level building on and transcending the limitations of the level below. At the bottom of this hierarchy lies prime matter, pure potentiality with no form or characteristics of its own. Prime matter never exists by itself. It always appears in combination with some form that makes it into something specific and actual. Moving up the ladder, we find increasingly complex combinations of matter and form, increasingly sophisticated levels of organization and being. Inanimate objects occupy the lower rungs. A rock, a clod of earth, a drop of water. These possess material form but no principle of life or self-movement. They can be moved by external forces, but they have no internal source of change or development. Their purpose is minimal, perhaps just to occupy their natural place in the cosmic order. Plants represent a crucial step upward. They possess what Aristotle called the nutritive soul, the principle of life that allows for nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Plants take in nutrients from their environment, transform them into their own substance, grow from seed to maturity according to their inherent form, and produce new plants of their kind. This capacity for self-directed growth and reproduction places plants infinitely above mere inanimate matter. Animals rise higher still. In addition to the nutritive soul, animals possess the sensitive soul, the capacity for perception, desire, and locomotion. Animals can sense their environment through sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. They can feel pleasure and pain. They can desire things and move themselves toward what they want and away from what threatens them. This sensory and emotional life makes animals vastly more complex than plants. But humans occupy a unique position at the pinnacle of earthly beings. Humans possess not only nutritive and sensitive souls, but also the rational soul, the capacity for thought, understanding, and deliberate choice. This rational capacity is what makes humans truly human and separates us qualitatively from all other animals. We can understand abstract principles, make mathematical calculations, grasp cause and effect, contemplate our own existence, and choose our actions based on reasoned judgment rather than mere instinct. Aristotle's biological investigations were remarkably sophisticated and accurate. He personally dissected and examined hundreds of animal species, making observations that wouldn't be confirmed or appreciated until centuries later. He correctly identified the mammalian nature of dolphins and whales when other observers classified them as fish. He described the development of chick embryos with stunning precision. He recognized that the heart was the center of the circulatory system. He catalogued and classified species using principles that anticipated modern taxonomy. What motivated this painstaking empirical work? Aristotle believed that nature itself was intelligible. The careful observation could reveal not just random facts, but rational patterns and purposes built into the structure of living things. Every organ, every structure, every behavior exists for a reason. The eye exists for seeing, the wing for flying, the stomach for digestion. Nature does nothing in vain. This was one of Aristotle's fundamental principles. This teleological approach to biology meant that Aristotle always asked, "What for?" questions alongside "how?" questions. It's not enough to describe how a heart pumps blood. We must understand that the purpose of the heart is to circulate blood throughout the body to maintain life. It's not enough to observe that birds have hollow bones. We must recognize that these bones serve the purpose of making flight possible. Form and function are intimately connected. The structure of an organism reflects its purposes and way of life. Aristotle recognized that biological organisms were far more than mere collections of parts. They are unified wholes where every part serves the functioning of the whole, and the whole is more than the sum of its parts. You cannot understand what a hand is by studying it in isolation from the body it serves. A severed hand is a hand in name only. It has lost its essential nature as an organ of grasping and manipulation. The parts only make sense in relation to the living whole. This holistic approach made Aristotle's biology remarkably modern in some ways. He understood that living systems are organized hierarchically, with simpler components organized into more complex structures that have their own emergent properties. He recognized that organisms develop according to internal principles rather than being assembled from outside. He saw that species have characteristic forms and behaviors that remain stable across generations, even as individual organisms come and go. Yet Aristotle's biology also contained ideas that would later be rejected. He believed in spontaneous generation, that some simple organisms could arise directly from non-living matter. He thought that the form of organisms came entirely from the male parent, while the female provided only matter. He assumed that species were fixed and unchanging, rather than evolving over time. He had no concept of genetic mechanisms or cellular structure. Despite these limitations, Aristotle's biological work established methodology and conceptual frameworks that shaped scientific investigation for centuries. His insistence on careful empirical observation, his recognition that living organisms require special modes of explanation, his attempt to classify and understand the diversity of life, all of these remain central to biological science today. For Aristotle, the human soul was not a separate spiritual substance trapped in a physical body, as Plato had taught. Rather, the soul is the form of the living body, the organizing principle that makes a physical organism into a living, functioning, unified being. Just as the shape of an axe is inseparable from the axe itself, you cannot have the form of an axe floating free of any physical object, so the soul is inseparable from the body it informs and animates. This view had radical implications. It meant that soul and body were not two separate things temporarily conjoined, but two aspects of a single living being, matter and form, body and soul, forming an inseparable unity. The soul is not in the body the way a pilot is in a ship, Plato's metaphor. Rather, the soul is the actuality of the body, the principle that makes the body alive and capable of its characteristic activities. This raised a profound question. If soul and body are inseparable, what happens when the body dies? Can the soul survive death? Aristotle's answer was complicated and ambiguous. For the most part, the soul depends on the body and cannot exist without it. The nutritive soul clearly requires a living organism. The sensitive soul requires sense organs. But what about the rational soul, the part of us that thinks and understands? Here Aristotle made a mysterious and controversial distinction. The rational soul has two aspects: the passive intellect, which receives and processes information from the senses, and the active intellect, which abstracts universal concepts from particular experiences and generates understanding. The passive intellect seems to be bodily and mortal, perishing when the body dies. But the active intellect is described as separable, impassible, and unmixed, suggesting that it might be immortal and even somehow divine. What exactly Aristotle meant by this has been debated for over 2,000 years. Did he believe in personal immortality? Was the active intellect individual or shared among all humans? The texts are frustratingly unclear, but what is clear is that Aristotle saw the activity of rational thought as the highest and most godlike of human capacities, the part of us that most closely resembles the divine nature of pure thought thinking itself. Aristotle's theory of knowledge was intimately connected to his psychology. How do we come to know universal truths when all we directly experience are particular things? How do we grasp the universal concept human when we only ever encounter individual humans? Aristotle's answer involved a sophisticated account of abstraction. Knowledge begins with sense perception. We see individual humans, hear individual sounds, touch individual textures. These sensory experiences leave traces or images in our minds, what Aristotle called phantasms. The active intellect then works on these images, abstracting from them the common features that define universal concepts. From seeing many individual humans, we extract the universal form human being. From experiencing many acts of justice, we grasp the universal concept justice. This process of abstraction is not arbitrary or conventional. We don't impose concepts on reality. Rather, we discover real forms that exist in things themselves. The form human really exists in Socrates and in Plato, not just in our minds. When our intellect abstracts this form, it is grasping something objective and real, not creating a useful fiction. For Aristotle, genuine knowledge meant grasping necessary truths through their causes. To truly know something is not merely to be aware of facts, but to understand why things must be as they are. Scientific knowledge, episteme, involves demonstrating conclusions from necessary first principles. We know that the angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, not just by measuring many triangles, but by understanding the geometrical principles that make this necessarily true of all triangles. This emphasis on causal understanding meant that Aristotle valued explanation over mere description. It's not enough to know that fire rises. We must understand why it rises, because fire naturally seeks its proper place above the earth. It's not enough to observe that all humans are mortal. We must grasp that mortality follows necessarily from the material nature of the human body. Aristotle distinguished several types of knowledge corresponding to different human concerns. Theoretical knowledge seeks truth for its own sake and includes physics, mathematics, and theology. Practical knowledge concerns how we should live and act, encompassing ethics and politics. Productive knowledge involves making things and includes crafts, arts, and rhetoric. Each type of knowledge has its own standards and methods appropriate to its subject matter. The highest form of knowledge is what Aristotle called Sophia wisdom, or philosophical understanding. The wise person not only knows many things but understands first principles and ultimate causes. They can see how particular facts fit into comprehensive explanations. They grasp not just that things are so, but why they must be so. This wisdom combines theoretical insight with comprehensive understanding, seeing reality steadily and seeing it whole. Before Aristotle, logic as we know it did not exist. Various philosophers had offered arguments and reasoned about reasoning, but no one had systematically investigated the structure of rational thought itself. Aristotle's great achievement in logic was to identify and formalize the patterns of valid reasoning that the human mind uses when thinking correctly. His logical works, collectively called the organon, or instrument of thought, remained the standard treatment of logic for over 2,000 years. At the heart of Aristotle's logic lies the syllogism. A syllogism is a form of argument where a conclusion follows necessarily from two premises. The classic example, All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. If the premises are true and the reasoning valid, the conclusion must be true. This is not rhetoric or persuasion. It is demonstrative reasoning that compels assent. Aristotle systematically catalogued all possible forms of syllogistic reasoning. He identified which combinations of premises yield valid conclusions and which do not. He discovered that there are 256 possible combinations of premise types, but only 24 of these produce valid syllogisms. This exhaustive analysis gave logicians a complete map of one essential terrain of human reasoning. But logic begins even more fundamentally with the categories, the basic ways that being can be predicated of things. Aristotle identified 10 fundamental categories: substance, what a thing is; quantity, how much; quality, what kind; relation, how connected to other things; place, where; time, when; position, in what posture; state, what condition; action, what doing; and passion, what doing; and passion, what being done to. Every meaningful statement about reality falls into one of these categories. Understanding these categories is crucial for avoiding confusion. Socrates is human, makes a statement about substance. Identifying what kind of thing Socrates is. Socrates is pale, makes a statement about quality, describing an accident or non-essential property. Confusing these categories leads to philosophical errors. Recognizing their distinctions helps us think more clearly about reality. Aristotle also developed a theory of definition that has shaped scientific and philosophical thinking ever since. To define something properly, we identify its genus, the broader category to which it belongs, and its specific difference, what distinguishes it from other members of that category. Humans are animals, genus who are rational, specific difference. This is why Aristotle's famous definition of the human being is rational animal. We are the species of animal distinguished by possessing reason. Good definitions capture the essence of things, what makes them what they are, rather than something else. They should be neither too broad, including things that don't belong, nor too narrow, excluding things that do belong. They should state necessary and sufficient conditions, characteristics that anything must have to be the kind of thing being defined, and that anything having these characteristics must be that kind of thing. Aristotle distinguished several types of statements according to their logical properties. Some statements are universal, all humans are mortal, others particular. Some humans are philosophers. Some are affirmative, Socrates is wise; others negative, Socrates is not wealthy. These distinctions matter because they determine which forms of inference are valid. The law of non-contradiction stands as the most fundamental principle of Aristotelian logic. This principle states that contradictory statements cannot both be true at the same time and in the same respect. Socrates is sitting, and Socrates is not sitting, cannot both be true simultaneously. This seems obvious, but Aristotle argued that all rational thought depends on this principle. Without it, words would mean nothing, reasoning would be impossible, and reality itself would be unintelligible. Some sophists had denied the law of non-contradiction, claiming that opposite statements could both be true. Aristotle responded that anyone who genuinely rejects this principle cannot think or speak coherently. Even to deny the law of non-contradiction is to affirm something and implicitly deny its opposite. The principle cannot be proven from anything more fundamental. It is the foundation on which all proof rests. But it can be defended by showing that denying it makes rational thought impossible. Aristotle also developed a sophisticated theory of modal logic, reasoning about possibility, necessity, and contingency. Some things are necessarily true, mathematical truths, logical principles. Others are possibly true, future contingent events. and still others are contingently true. Facts that happen to be so, but might have been otherwise. Different logical rules apply to these different modes of truth. The influence of Aristotelian logic can hardly be overstated. For medieval philosophers, mastering Aristotle's logical works was the foundation of all education. Islamic philosophers like Avicenna, Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, and Christian theologians like Aquinas all built their systems on Aristotelian logical foundations. Even when later thinkers like Bacon and Descartes criticized Aristotelian logic, they did so using logical tools that Aristotle had forged. Only in the 19th century did formal logic begin to move beyond the Aristotelian framework with the development of mathematical logic and symbolic notation. But even modern logic incorporates many Aristotelian insights, and syllogistic reasoning remains a valid and useful form of inference. Aristotle's achievement was to identify and systematize patterns of reasoning that the human mind naturally uses, a contribution that remains relevant as long as humans think. When Aristotle turned his attention to ethics, he began not with abstract principles or divine commands, but with a simple observation about human nature. Everything we do for the sake of something we regard as good. We eat to satisfy hunger. We work to earn money. We study to gain knowledge. But these goals are instrumental, pursued for the sake of something else. We want health not just for its own sake, but because it enables us to do other things we value. This chain of instrumental goods cannot extend infinitely. Eventually, we must reach some good that we pursue for its own sake, an ultimate goal that gives purpose and meaning to all our other pursuits. What is this ultimate good? Aristotle's answer was eudaimonia, a Greek word usually translated as happiness, but perhaps better rendered as flourishing or living well. But what does eudaimonia actually consist of? People disagree wildly about what happiness means. Some identify it with pleasure, others with wealth or honor, still others with virtue or contemplation. Aristotle's task in ethics was to determine what genuine human flourishing involves and how we can achieve it. His method was characteristically empirical and teleological. To understand human flourishing, we must first understand human nature. What kind of being a human is, and what purposes or functions are distinctive to human life. Just as a good knife is one that cuts well, and a good eye is one that sees well, a good human life is one that performs well, the functions distinctive to human beings. What is distinctive about humans? Not simply being alive, for plants are alive too. Not sensation and movement, for animals share these capacities. What sets humans apart is reason, the capacity for rational thought and deliberate choice. Therefore, eudaimonia must involve the excellent performance of our rational capacities. A flourishing human life is one lived in accordance with reason and virtue. Aristotle distinguished two fundamental kinds of virtue or excellence. Intellectual virtues involve the perfection of our rational capacities themselves, wisdom, understanding, prudence. Moral virtues involve rational control and proper ordering of our desires, emotions, and actions, courage, temperance, justice, generosity. Both types are necessary for complete human flourishing, though intellectual virtues are higher because they exercise our most distinctive and godlike capacities. The moral virtues are not innate. We aren't born courageous or tempered. Rather, we acquire these virtues through habituation, through repeatedly performing virtuous actions until they become second nature. We become brave by practicing brave acts, generous by practicing generous acts, temperate by practicing temperate acts. Virtue is like a skill that must be developed through practice. But what makes an action virtuous? Here Aristotle introduced his famous doctrine of the mean. Virtue lies in finding the middle ground between extremes, between excess and deficiency in our feelings and actions. Courage is the mean between cowardice, too little confidence in facing danger, and foolhardiness, too much confidence. Generosity is the mean between stinginess, too little giving, and wastefulness, too much giving. Proper pride is the mean between excessive humility and arrogance. This doctrine is easily misunderstood. Aristotle is not recommending mediocrity or suggesting that virtue is always found by splitting the difference. The mean is not the same for everyone in every situation. It must be determined by practical wisdom in light of circumstances. What counts as courageous for a soldier in battle differs from what counts as courageous for a civilian in peacetime. The mean is relative to us and our situation, requiring judgment to identify. Moreover, some actions and feelings have no mean. They are wrong by their very nature. Murder, theft, adultery, spite, envy. These are not excessive or deficient versions of legitimate feelings or actions. They are intrinsically vicious. You cannot commit adultery temperately or murder courageously. Some acts are beyond the pale, regardless of circumstances. Practical wisdom, what Aristotle called phronesis, is the intellectual virtue that enables us to identify the mean and act accordingly. The practically wise person has developed the ability to perceive what virtue requires in concrete situations, to deliberate well about means to good ends, and to choose actions that promote genuine flourishing. This wisdom cannot be reduced to following rules. It requires experience, judgment, and insight into particular circumstances. Aristotle recognized that virtuous action requires not just right behavior, but right motivation and feeling. The truly courageous person doesn't just perform brave acts, they act bravely at the right time, in the right way, toward the right objects, and with the appropriate feelings. The action flows from a stable character that finds nobility and satisfaction in virtuous activity itself, not from external compulsion or mere calculation of consequences. This means that becoming virtuous is a long process of character formation. We cannot simply decide to be virtuous and become so instantly. We must train our desires and emotions through repeated practice until we spontaneously feel and act as virtue requires. The virtuous person has transformed their character so deeply that they actually enjoy doing what is noble and find vicious actions repugnant. But can we achieve eudaimonia through virtue alone? Aristotle was too realistic to claim that virtue guarantees happiness. We need external goods as well: health, some degree of wealth, friends, family, favorable circumstances. A person tortured on the rack or suffering catastrophic misfortune cannot be truly flourishing, no matter how virtuous. While virtue is the most important component of happiness, we also need fortune's cooperation. Still, virtue makes us as happy as circumstances allow. The virtuous person handles misfortune better than the vicious person. They find deep satisfaction in virtuous activity itself. They enjoy the highest pleasures, those that come from exercising our rational capacities excellently. And in their best moments, they taste the divine life of pure contemplative activity. Unlike modern ethical theories that focus primarily on individual choice and obligation, Aristotle devoted extensive attention to friendship as essential to human flourishing. We are by nature social creatures who cannot achieve eudaimonia in isolation. We need friends not merely as instruments for our purposes, but as essential components of the good life itself. Understanding friendship reveals much about Aristotle's broader ethical vision. Aristotle distinguished three types of friendship based on what binds people together. Friendships of utility are based on mutual benefit. Business relationships, political alliances, neighborly cooperation. Each person values the other for what they can provide. These friendships are conditional and temporary. They last only as long as the benefit continues. Friendships of pleasure are based on enjoyment of each other's company, drinking companions, hobby partners, entertainment. Again, these are conditional, lasting only while the pleasure remains. The highest form of friendship is what Aristotle called perfect or complete friendship. Friendship based on shared virtue and mutual recognition of each other's good character. Such friends love each other for themselves, not for any external benefit or pleasure. They wish each other well for the other's sake. They share values and pursue excellence together. This kind of friendship is rare, requiring virtue, time, intimacy, and mutual understanding. Complete friendship is only possible between good people. The vicious cannot sustain such friendships because they don't even maintain consistent relationships with themselves. They're torn by conflicting desires and regret their own actions. Bad people might have utility friendships or pleasure friendships, but they cannot achieve the deep unity that characterizes perfect friendship. Such friendships profoundly contribute to flourishing. Friends provide practical help in times of need. They share our joys and sorrows, making happiness sweeter and misfortune more bearable. They serve as mirrors in which we see ourselves more clearly. Through intimate conversation with friends, we develop our thinking and refine our judgment. The good person actually needs friends more than the bad person does, because excellent activity is enhanced when shared with excellent companions. But friendship involves peculiar paradoxes that Aristotle carefully examines. Friends want what is best for each other, yet they also want their friends to remain similar to themselves. If your friend became a god, should you still desire to be their friend, knowing you could not share that exalted state? If you love your friend for their virtue, do you stop loving them if they become vicious? These puzzles reveal deep questions about the nature of love and the identity of persons across time. Aristotle argues that true friends become like oneself, another self, as he memorably puts it. In some sense, the friend becomes an extension of one's own identity. This is why we want friends to share our activities and interests, why we suffer when they suffer, why their good becomes our own good. The boundaries between self and friend partially dissolve in perfect friendship. This has profound implications for self-love, a topic Aristotle treats with characteristic subtlety. In one sense, self-love is the root of all vice, the selfish person who grasps for more than their share and sacrifices others for their own advantage. But in another sense, proper self-love is the foundation of virtue. The good person loves what is best in themselves, their rational nature and their capacity for virtue. They love themselves by living excellently, which paradoxically may require sacrificing their own pleasure, wealth, or even life for the sake of what is noble. The virtuous person can sacrifice themselves for friends or country because they understand that acting nobly is more choice-worthy than mere life or comfort. They gain what is most valuable, the beautiful action itself, even at cost to lesser goods. This is self-love rightly understood, preferring what is genuinely best for oneself, which is excellent activity according to virtue. Friendship also raises political questions. What is the relationship between friendship and justice? Aristotle observes that where friendship exists, justice is largely unnecessary. Friends naturally want to help each other and treat each other fairly without requiring external enforcement. Indeed, the highest form of justice has a friendship-like quality. It involves not merely respecting rights, but genuine concern for others' welfare. This connects to Aristotle's conviction that humans are political animals. We naturally form communities and cannot achieve our full potential except within well-ordered societies. The polis city-state exists not merely for mutual defense or economic cooperation, but for enabling its citizens to live well and develop virtue. Good laws and institutions create conditions for human flourishing, educating citizens in virtue and facilitating friendship among them. Man is by nature a political animal, Aristotle famously declared. This was not merely an observation about human sociology, but a deep claim about human nature and purpose. We aren't just capable of forming political communities. We're designed for political life and cannot achieve our proper development except within such communities. To live outside the polis, one must be either a beast or a god. Humans are neither. We need the city as the proper context for flourishing. Why are humans political by nature? Aristotle offers several arguments. We alone among animals possess speech, not merely the capacity to signal pleasure and pain like other creatures, but the ability to discuss justice and injustice, advantage and harm, right and wrong. This capacity for moral discourse would be pointless if we were meant to live alone. Speech exists precisely to facilitate the communal deliberation and shared values that make political life possible. Moreover, human beings cannot be self-sufficient individually or even in families. We need complex division of labor, exchange of goods and services, common defense, and mutual education that only larger communities can provide. The household handles reproduction and daily needs, but only the polis can provide the conditions for the good life. Education in virtue, administration of justice, cultivation of the arts and sciences, and creation of a stable environment where humans can develop their potential. The polis emerges naturally from pre-political forms of association. Individuals form families for reproduction and mutual support. Families join into villages for more complex cooperation. Villages unite into city-states capable of full self-sufficiency and political life. This natural development shows that political community isn't an artificial construct imposed on humans, but the fulfillment of our natural sociality. Yet, not all political systems are equally good. Aristotle systematically investigated the constitutions of 58 Greek city-states, analyzing how different systems of government performed. From this empirical foundation, he developed a sophisticated political theory. He distinguished regimes by two criteria: who rules one person, few people, or many people, and whether they rule for the common good or their own private advantage. This generates 6 basic regime types. Rule by one person for the common good is kingship, for private advantage is tyranny. Rule by the few for common good is aristocracy, for private advantage is oligarchy. Rule by the many for common good is polity, for private advantage is democracy. In Aristotle's technical vocabulary, democracy meant mob rule by the poor for their own benefit, while polity meant constitutional government by the many for the common good. Each regime type has characteristic strengths and pathologies. Monarchy concentrates wisdom and decision-making, but risks becoming tyranny. Aristocracy promotes excellence, but can deteriorate into oligarchy serving the rich. Democracy allows widespread participation, but can degenerate into mob rule. Polity balances these concerns by mixing elements of democracy and oligarchy, giving both rich and poor a voice while preventing either from dominating. Aristotle generally favored mixed constitutions and what we might call the rule of the middle class. Where a large middle class exists, people who are neither very rich nor very poor conditions are most favorable for stable, just government. The middle class has enough property to have a stake in order and law, but not so much that they're tempted to oppress others. They're neither desperate for redistribution nor arrogant with wealth. But Aristotle's political thought goes beyond regime classification to address fundamental questions about justice, law, and political obligation. Justice, he argues, involves treating equals equally and unequals unequally according to relevant differences. But what differences are relevant? Should political power be distributed according to wealth, virtue, freedom, or something else? Different regimes answer differently, and Aristotle analyzes the strengths and weaknesses of each answer. He distinguishes several types of justice: Distributive justice concerns fair distribution of honors, wealth, and offices according to merit. Corrective or commutative justice concerns fair exchange and rectification of wrongs between individuals. Political justice concerns the fair relationship between citizens and their government. Each type has its own principles and standards appropriate to its domain. Law plays a crucial role in achieving justice. Good laws educate citizens in virtue by habituating them to proper behavior. They provide stability and predictability that mere personal rule cannot match. They embody the collective wisdom of the community rather than the potentially arbitrary judgment of individuals. Aristotle wasn't naive about law. He recognized that laws must be adapted to circumstances and that rigid legalism can produce injustice. But well-designed laws administered wisely are essential for political flourishing. The purpose of the polis is not merely to enable life, but to promote the good life. This means political communities have a legitimate interest in cultivating virtue among citizens. Education is therefore a political concern, not merely a private matter. The polis should educate youth in virtue, train them in civic responsibility, and create institutions that reinforce good character. This isn't totalitarian indoctrination. Aristotle respects individual development and the authority of families, but it does mean politics has a moral dimension that mere liberal neutrality cannot capture. When Aristotle turned his attention to physics and cosmology, he wasn't engaging in idle speculation, but seeking to understand the natural world with the same systematic rigor he brought to logic and ethics. His physics, the study of nature, physis in all its forms, aimed to explain motion, change, place, time, infinity, and the basic structure of physical reality. While much of his specific physics has been superseded, his approach and conceptual frameworks shaped scientific thinking for nearly 2,000 years. Aristotle's physics rests on the fundamental observation that natural objects move and change. A seed grows into a plant. Water flows downhill. The moon orbits the earth. All of nature is characterized by motion and transformation. But what exactly is motion and what causes it? These seemingly simple questions require sophisticated analysis. Motion, for Aristotle, is the actualization of potential qua potential. When a seed grows into a plant, its potential for being a plant is gradually actualized. While it's still developing, neither fully potential nor fully actual, it is in motion. Motion is thus the middle state between pure potency and complete actuality. This definition applies not just to locomotion, but to all forms of change, growth and diminution, alteration of qualities, coming to be and passing away. Aristotle identified 4 types of motion or change. Locomotion involves change of place. Alteration involves change of quality, as when something becomes hot or cold, white or black. Growth and diminution involve change of quantity, becoming larger or smaller. And substantial change involves generation and corruption, coming to be and passing away of substances themselves. Every motion requires a cause, specifically, an efficient cause that actuates potential. But what causes the cause? Aristotle argued against infinite regress. There cannot be an infinite chain of movers, each moved by something else. Eventually, we must reach an unmoved mover, something that causes motion without itself being moved or changed. This ultimate source of cosmic motion would become crucial to Aristotle's theology. Natural objects have internal principles of motion and rest. They move and change according to their own natures, not merely through external compulsion. This distinguishes natural objects from artifacts. A stone falls downward because of its nature as a heavy element seeking its natural place. An acorn grows into an oak because of its internal principle of development. Nature is thus intrinsically dynamic and directional. Aristotle envisioned the cosmos as finite and spherical, with Earth at the center. The universe divides into two fundamentally different regions. The sublunary realm below the moon consists of four elements: earth, water, air, fire, that combine and recombine, generating and corrupting, subject to change and imperfection. The superlunary realm, the heavens, consists of a fifth element, ether or quintessence, that is perfect, unchanging, and eternal. Each element has a natural place and naturally moves toward it when displaced. Earth is heaviest and seeks the center. Water is lighter and rests on earth. Air is lighter still and rises above water. Fire is lightest and seeks the highest sublunary region. This explains why rocks fall, flames rise, and water finds its level. Violent motion occurs when objects are forced from their natural places. Natural motion occurs when they return. The celestial bodies, moon, sun, planets, stars, move in perfect circles, because circular motion is eternal and involves no change of place in the absolute sense. The outermost sphere of the fixed stars rotates once per day, imparting motion to the inner spheres. Each celestial sphere has its own unmoved mover that serves as its final cause, inspiring it to eternal circular motion through being an object of love and desire. Time, for Aristotle, is the measure of motion with respect to before and after. Without change, there could be no time, because time is fundamentally the numbering of change. Yet time also has a kind of objectivity. It exists in the natural world, not merely in our minds. The regular motions of celestial bodies provide natural measures of time that make calendars and clocks possible. Space or place is more puzzling. Aristotle rejected the atomist concept of absolute void empty space existing independently of bodies. He argued that a genuine vacuum is impossible. Place is the innermost boundary of the containing body, the inner surface of whatever surrounds an object. This makes place relative to surrounding objects rather than an absolute container. Aristotle denied the existence of actual infinities. There is no infinitely large body, no infinite magnitude that could be traversed. But he accepted potential infinity, the endless process of division or addition. You can always divide a line segment further, always add another number. The infinity exists in the process, not in a completed totality. His physics also included sophisticated treatments of continuity, causation, and the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. While he valued mathematical description of nature, he insisted that mathematics abstracts from physical reality and cannot fully capture it. Physical objects exist in time and space, subject to change and imperfection in ways that mathematical objects are not. At the summit of Aristotle's metaphysical system stands his conception of God as the unmoved mover, the ultimate cause and explanation of cosmic motion and change. This theology emerges not from revelation or religious experience, but from rational analysis of the natural world. It represents one of the most influential attempts to demonstrate God's existence through philosophical argument. The reasoning proceeds from Aristotle's analysis of motion and change. Everything in the physical world moves and changes, but motion requires a cause. Something actual must actualize what is potential. We cannot have an infinite regress of causes, with each motion caused by a prior motion extending back forever. There must be a first cause of motion, that is itself unmoved. Why must this first cause be unmoved? Because if it were moved, it would be potential in some respect, requiring something else to actualize that potential. But we're seeking the ultimate explanation, the ground of all motion and change. This can only be something that is pure actuality, with no unfulfilled potential whatsoever. Something that is fully and perfectly actual in every respect. What could such a being be like? It must be immaterial, because matter is inherently potential. It must be eternal and unchanging, because change involves potentiality. It must be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. It must be one and indivisible, because multiplicity involves composition and composition involves potentiality. It must be simple, without parts or internal complexity. But what does such a being do? It cannot engage in physical action, which would involve change and potentiality. Rather, the unmoved mover causes motion by being an object of love and desire. The celestial spheres move in eternal circular rotation because they are attracted to the perfection of the unmoved mover. They love the divine and seek to imitate its perfection through eternal, unchanging motion. The unmoved mover's only activity is thought-pure intellectual contemplation. But what does it think about? It cannot think about changing things or material objects because that would make it dependent on inferior realities. Rather, it thinks about the highest and most perfect object of thought, itself. God is thought thinking itself, pure self-contemplative consciousness that is both the thinking subject and the thought object. This might seem narcissistic or empty, but Aristotle sees it as the most perfect state imaginable. All thought aims at truth and understanding. The highest thought would grasp the highest truth. The highest truth is the perfect being itself. Therefore, God's thought is eternally occupied with understanding its own perfect nature, an activity that is utterly fulfilling and lacking nothing. Human happiness gives us a glimpse of this divine life. When we engage in philosophical contemplation, we're exercising the activity most similar to God's eternal self-contemplation. In those moments of pure understanding, we transcend our physical limitations and participate in the divine nature. This is why Aristotle says that philosophical contemplation is the highest form of happiness available to humans. But Aristotle's God is radically different from the personal God of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. The unmoved mover doesn't know particular facts about the world or individual creatures. It doesn't respond to prayers or care about human affairs. It doesn't create the world through deliberate choice. It doesn't judge, reward, or punish. It simply exists in eternal self-contemplation, serving as the final cause of cosmic motion through being an object of attraction and aspiration. This conception would create profound tensions when medieval philosophers tried to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with scriptural religion. Can the God of Abraham really be an unmoved mover engaged only in self-contemplation? Can divine providence coexist with God's complete self-sufficiency and unchangingness? Can creation be eternal rather than temporal? These questions would occupy some of the greatest minds in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian philosophy. Aristotle also speculated about the number of unmoved movers. His astronomical system required multiple celestial spheres, one for each planet, and the fixed stars. Did each sphere have its own unmoved mover as its final cause? The text is ambiguous, but Aristotle seems to have thought that while there is one ultimate unmoved mover for the outermost sphere, there might be additional unmoved movers for the other celestial motions. The divine life represents the standard and goal toward which all of nature strives. Everything seeks the good, and the highest good is the perfect actuality of the unmoved mover. The entire cosmic order is oriented toward this supreme principle. In this sense, Aristotle's universe is fundamentally purposive and value-laden, not a meaningless machine, but a great hierarchy of being aspiring toward divine perfection. When Aristotle composed his Poetics, he wasn't offering idle aesthetic opinions, but developing a systematic theory of art based on careful observation and philosophical analysis. His approach to poetry and drama exemplifies his broader method. Begin with empirical examination of excellent examples, identify what makes them excellent, and abstract general principles that explain their effects. The treatise focuses primarily on tragedy, which Aristotle considers the highest form of poetry. Tragedy imitates serious action in elevated language, arousing pity and fear in audiences and producing catharsis, a purging or purification of these emotions. This definition contains multiple elements worth unpacking. First, poetry is fundamentally mimesis, imitation or representation of reality. This seems obvious, but it has profound implications. Unlike history, which records what actually happened, poetry represents what might happen according to probability or necessity. This makes poetry more philosophical than history, because it deals with universal patterns and possibilities rather than mere particular facts. What poets represent is human action, specifically actions that reveal character and lead to happiness or misery. Tragedy focuses on the downfall of basically good people through hamartia, often translated as tragic flaw, but perhaps better understood as an error in judgment or a mistake with serious consequences. The tragic hero isn't perfectly virtuous. That would make their fall merely pathetic rather than tragic, nor deeply vicious. That would make it deserved, and therefore not truly tragic. They're fundamentally decent, but flawed, making their downfall both undeserved and comprehensible. The structure of tragedy must follow specific patterns to achieve its effects. It should be unified, representing a single complete action with a beginning, middle, and end organically connected. The plot should be complex rather than simple, involving reversal, where an action produces the opposite of its intended effect, and recognition, where the protagonist discovers something crucial about their situation or identity. These elements generate the emotional power of tragedy. The most effective tragedies involve characters discovering terrible truths, just as their situations reverse from good fortune to bad. Oedipus discovers his true identity and the full horror of his actions at the very moment his world collapses. Such moments of recognition combined with reversal produce the most powerful tragic effects. Aristotle insists that plot is more important than character in tragedy. This might seem strange to modern readers accustomed to psychological drama, but his point is that drama represents action, and character is revealed through action. Even characters who are not fully developed psychologically can be dramatically effective if the plot, the arrangement of incidents, is well constructed. The structure of events matters more than subtle character portrayal. Tragedy produces catharsis, a purging or purification of pity and fear. Exactly what Aristotle meant by this has been debated for centuries. Does watching tragedy help us process and moderate these emotions in healthy ways? Does it provide a safe outlet for feelings that might otherwise be harmful? Does it clarify and refine our emotional responses? The text doesn't fully explain, but the basic idea is that tragedy has a beneficial psychological effect on audiences through its representation of pitiable and fearful events. Poetry serves important educational and social functions. Through imitation, we learn about human nature, moral psychology, and the consequences of various choices and character traits. We see vividly how pride leads to downfall, how good intentions can produce disaster, how fate and choice interact in human affairs. These lessons sink deeper than abstract moralizing, because they're embodied in concrete dramatic action. Aristotle also discusses other poetic genres: epic, comedy, dithyramb. Epic poetry shares tragedy's serious subject matter, but uses narrative rather than dramatic form, and can cover longer time spans and more diverse events. Comedy imitates inferior people, though not extremely vicious ones, and aims to provoke laughter by showing incongruity and absurdity, rather than tragedy's pity and fear. Throughout his analysis, Aristotle emphasizes that poetic excellence involves craft and technique, not just inspiration. Good poets understand their medium, the possibilities and limitations of language, meter, dramatic structure, and performance. They make deliberate choices about how to construct their works to achieve desired effects. Poetry is a technique, a rational skill that can be learned and practiced, not merely divine madness. Aristotle's rhetoric represents the first systematic analysis of persuasive speech and argumentation. Far from dismissing rhetoric as mere manipulation, as Plato had done, Aristotle recognized it as a legitimate and necessary art with important ethical and political dimensions. The ability to persuade is essential in law courts, political assemblies, and public discourse. The question is not whether to use rhetoric, but how to use it well and for good purposes. Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic, the art of arguing from common opinions to probable conclusions. While dialectic aims at truth through logical examination, rhetoric aims at persuasion through all available means. This doesn't make it dishonest. Rather, it recognizes that human decision-making involves not just pure logic, but emotions, character judgments, and contextual considerations. Good rhetoric addresses the whole person, not just the rational intellect. Aristotle identifies three modes of persuasion. Logos appeals to reason through logical argument and evidence. Ethos appeals to the speaker's character and credibility. Pathos appeals to the audience's emotions and values. Effective rhetoric combines all three, using arguments that are logically sound, delivered by speakers who demonstrate good character, and adapted to audiences' emotional states and concerns. Logical argument in rhetoric differs from strict demonstration in science. Rhetoric uses enthymemes, abbreviated syllogisms that often leave premises unstated, and examples, inductive arguments from particular cases. These forms of reasoning are appropriate when dealing with human affairs that admit of alternative possibilities rather than necessary truths. We cannot demonstrate with certainty how juries will decide or which policies will succeed, but we can offer probable arguments and persuasive examples. Character matters immensely in persuasion. Audiences are more likely to believe speakers they perceive as knowledgeable, virtuous, and well-intentioned. Speakers should therefore demonstrate practical wisdom, showing they understand the issues, virtue, showing they're morally good, and goodwill, showing they care about the audience's interests. These character qualities must be displayed in the speech itself, not merely possessed in reality. Emotion also plays a legitimate role. Aristotle analyzes various emotions: anger, pity, fear, confidence, shame, indignation, explaining what each involves, what causes it, and toward whom it's directed. This isn't manipulation, but recognition that human judgment is properly influenced by appropriate emotions. Jurors should feel anger at injustice, pity for undeserved suffering, fear of genuine threats. The speaker's job is to help audiences feel what they should feel about the matters at hand. Aristotle distinguishes three types of rhetoric, corresponding to three contexts. Forensic rhetoric occurs in law courts, focusing on past actions and questions of justice and injustice. Deliberative rhetoric occurs in political assemblies, focusing on future actions and questions of expediency and harm. Epidictic rhetoric occurs in ceremonial contexts, focusing on present qualities and questions of honor and dishonor. Each type has its own characteristic topics, styles, and modes of proof. Style matters as well as substance. Aristotle discusses appropriate use of metaphor, clarity versus ornamentation, rhythm and structure of sentences, and arrangement of speeches. Good style is clear without being pedestrian, elevated without being obscure, rhythmic without being sing-song. It should be appropriate to the subject, audience, and speaker. Different contexts require different stylistic choices. The arrangement of speeches follows natural divisions. The essential parts are statement of the case and proof. But effective speeches often include introduction to gain attention and establish ethos, narration to explain the background, refutation to answer objections, and conclusion to summarize and stir emotions. Each part serves specific rhetorical functions that contribute to overall persuasiveness. Aristotle's treatment of rhetoric is remarkably sophisticated and psychologically astute. He recognizes the power of language to shape perception and judgment, while insisting that this power should serve truth and justice rather than manipulation. He provides tools for both producing and analyzing persuasive discourse, enabling speakers to argue more effectively and audiences to evaluate arguments more critically. The ethical dimension is crucial. Rhetoric can be used for good or ill, just as medicine can heal or poison. The art itself is neutral, but its practitioners have moral obligations to use it well. Speakers should aim at truth, respect audiences' autonomy, and serve the common good. When rhetoric is corrupted into mere sophistry, using fallacious arguments and emotional manipulation to win at any cost, it becomes a danger to society and politics. The centuries after Aristotle's death in 322 BCE, his works largely disappeared from Western Europe. His treatises had been composed for teaching purposes, lecture notes rather than polished literary productions, and they survived only in manuscript form. While his more popular dialogues, now lost, had been widely read in antiquity, his technical works fell into obscurity in the Latin West during the early Middle Ages. But Aristotle's thought was preserved and developed in the Islamic world. Beginning in the 9th century, Arabic scholars translated his works from Greek and Syriac, producing sophisticated commentaries that interpreted and extended his ideas. Thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes made Aristotle the foundation of Islamic philosophy, synthesizing his thought with Islamic theology and developing his physics, metaphysics, and psychology in original directions. Through Islamic Spain and Sicily, Aristotle's works gradually returned to Western Europe in Latin translation during the 12th and 13th centuries. This recovery revolutionized medieval intellectual life. Suddenly, Christian scholars encountered a comprehensive philosophical system that claimed to explain all of reality through reason alone, without appeal to scriptural revelation. The challenge was immense. How could traditional Christian theology coexist with this powerful pagan philosophy? Early responses were often hostile. Some churchmen saw Aristotelian philosophy as a threat to faith, particularly doctrines that seemed incompatible with Christianity, the eternity of the world, the impossibility of individual providence, the denial of personal immortality. Some of Aristotle's propositions were officially condemned by ecclesiastical authorities. Using his philosophy seemed dangerous, but other thinkers saw opportunity rather than threat. Couldn't Aristotelian philosophy provide rational foundations for Christian belief? Couldn't natural reason, following Aristotelian methods, demonstrate truths that faith had always affirmed? Couldn't his logical and scientific tools help theology become more rigorous and systematic? Perhaps Athens and Jerusalem could be reconciled after all. The greatest achievement of this reconciliation was the work of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas systematically reinterpreted Aristotle in ways compatible with Christian doctrine, while preserving the power and rigor of Aristotelian philosophy. The eternity of the world? Aristotle was wrong. Reason alone cannot determine whether the world is eternal or created, so revelation is needed to tell us it was created. Individual providence? Aristotle's conception of the unmoved mover was incomplete. The true God knows and cares for each creature individually. Personal immortality? Properly understood, Aristotle's psychology implies that the rational soul survives bodily death. Aquinas built a magnificent synthesis that gave Western Christianity a philosophical foundation it had previously lacked. Using Aristotelian logic, he organized theology into a systematic science. Using Aristotelian metaphysics, he explained the relationship between God and creatures, essence and existence, faith and reason. Using Aristotelian ethics, he developed a comprehensive moral theology. Using Aristotelian politics, he explained the nature and purpose of secular authority. This synthesis became immensely influential. For centuries, educated Europeans learned philosophy by studying Aristotle, usually through Thomistic interpretations. Universities were organized around Aristotelian curricula. The natural sciences were pursued within Aristotelian frameworks. Ethics and politics drew on Aristotelian virtue theory. Logic meant Aristotelian logic. To be educated meant to know Aristotle. But cracks eventually appeared in the synthesis. Aristotelian physics increasingly seemed inadequate to explain observed phenomena. His cosmology conflicted with heliocentric astronomy. His theory of motion couldn't account for the parabolic paths of projectiles. His denial of void space seemed wrong. Gradually, the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries dismantled Aristotelian natural philosophy, replacing it with mathematical physics and mechanistic explanations. Yet, even as Aristotelian physics fell, much of his philosophical framework remained influential. His logic continued to be taught. His metaphysical concepts, substance, accident, potency, act, form, matter, remained standard philosophical vocabulary. His ethical theory continued to shape moral philosophy. His political insights remained relevant to political thought. The overthrow of Aristotelian science didn't mean the overthrow of Aristotelian philosophy. The rise of modern philosophy in the 17th century involved a systematic rejection of Aristotelian thought. Descartes, often considered the father of modern philosophy, explicitly opposed Aristotelian methods and doctrines. Instead of beginning from sense perception and inductively building knowledge, Descartes sought indubitable foundations through radical doubt and pure reason. Instead of explaining natural phenomena through substantial forms and final causes, he proposed a mechanistic physics governed by mathematical laws. Francis Bacon attacked Aristotelian logic as sterile and unproductive. Scholastic philosophers had spent centuries making logical distinctions and conducting syllogistic demonstrations, but where were the practical results? Science needed a new method, not deduction from first principles, but induction from carefully observed facts. Experimentation, not contemplation, would unlock nature's secrets. Aristotle's authority had stifled rather than advanced knowledge. The new physics of Galileo and Newton definitively superseded Aristotelian natural philosophy. Galileo's experiments on falling bodies showed that Aristotle was simply wrong about natural motion. Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation explain celestial and terrestrial mechanics better than Aristotelian cosmology ever could. The new science didn't need formal causes, final causes, or natural places. Matter in motion, governed by mathematical laws, could explain everything. The empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, rejected Aristotelian theories of knowledge and substance. There are no innate forms or essences grasped by the intellect through abstraction. All knowledge comes from sense experience, and what we call substances are just collections of sensible qualities held together by convention or habit. The whole Aristotelian metaphysical apparatus seemed like empty speculation, unsupported by experience. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Aristotle's influence had waned dramatically. His physics was dead, his cosmology was replaced. His biology was superseded by evolutionary theory. His logic seemed limited compared to modern symbolic logic. Progressive thinkers viewed Aristotelianism as medieval superstition, an obstacle to scientific and social progress that modernity had rightly overcome. Yet in the 20th century, something remarkable happened. Aristotle began to be taken seriously again by philosophers, if not by scientists. Several factors contributed to this revival. Careful historical scholarship revealed that many Aristotelian doctrines were actually distortions introduced by later interpreters. Reading Aristotle in the original Greek, scholars discovered a more subtle and sophisticated thinker than the caricature that modernity had rejected. Analytic philosophers discovered that Aristotle had anticipated many of their concerns. His careful attention to language and logic, his analysis of concepts, his attention to the structure of arguments, these resonated with the analytic tradition. Metaphysicians found his account of substance, properties, and causation more promising than Humean skepticism or positivist reductionism. His theory of categories influenced modern metaphysical categorization schemes. Philosophy of science rediscovered the value of Aristotelian approaches. While his specific physics was wrong, his recognition that living organisms require special modes of explanation seemed vindicated by biology's resistance to simple reductionism. His emphasis on functional explanation and his teleological biology influenced philosophy of biology. His methodological pluralism, the recognition that different domains require different explanatory strategies, seemed more sophisticated than reductionist scientism. Most dramatically, virtue ethics underwent a major revival, largely by returning to Aristotelian roots. In 1958, philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe published a landmark essay arguing that modern moral philosophy had reached a dead end with its focus on duties, rules, and consequences. She advocated returning to Aristotelian virtue ethics with its emphasis on character, flourishing, and the virtues necessary for living well. This sparked renewed interest in Aristotelian ethics. Contemporary virtue ethicists like Philippa Foot, Rosalind Hursthouse, and Alasdair MacIntyre developed sophisticated neo-Aristotelian ethical theories. These theories focused on what it means to live well as a human being, what character traits enable flourishing, and how we acquire and exercise virtues. They offered alternatives to utilitarian and Kantian ethics that seem more psychologically realistic and practically applicable. Political philosophy also saw Aristotelian revival. Communitarian critics of liberalism drew on Aristotle's emphasis on community, shared values, and the political nature of human beings. They argued that liberalism's focus on individual rights and procedural fairness neglected the communal context necessary for human flourishing. Aristotle's insight that we're political animals whose good is inherently social seemed relevant to debates about individualism versus community. Even in philosophy of mind, some thinkers found Aristotelian hylomorphism, the view that soul is the form of the body, more promising than Cartesian dualism or reductive materialism. If mind is the organizational principle of living bodies, rather than a separate substance or mere epiphenomenon, we might avoid the intractable problems that have plagued modern philosophy of mind. Contemporary Aristotelians don't simply repeat ancient doctrines. They reconstruct Aristotelian insights in modern contexts, developing them in light of contemporary knowledge and concerns. The goal is not to restore medieval Aristotelianism, but to recover what remains valuable in Aristotle's approach. His emphasis on empirical observation, his respect for common sense and ordinary language, his attention to the particular and concrete, his recognition of complexity and irreducible plurality, his integration of theoretical and practical wisdom. One of Aristotle's most important and enduringly relevant insights concerns the nature of practical reasoning and judgment in human affairs. Unlike theoretical knowledge, which deals with necessary truths and universal principles, practical wisdom phronesis operates in the realm of contingency, particularity, and approximation. Understanding this distinction helps us appreciate both the power and the limits of human reason. Aristotle recognized that ethical and political life cannot be reduced to applying universal rules mechanically. Human situations are too complex, variable, and context-dependent. What courage requires in battle differs from what it requires in facing illness. What counts as generous in one economic context might count as wasteful in another. Ethical rules are guidelines that must be interpreted wisely in light of circumstances, not algorithms that generate correct answers automatically. This is why Aristotle says that ethics is not an exact science like mathematics. We should not seek more precision than the subject matter allows. In ethics and politics, we aim at rough truths and general patterns, not mathematical certainty. Someone who demands logical proofs in ethics or relies only on experience in mathematics has failed to understand the differences between domains of inquiry. Practical wisdom requires experience, maturity, and judgment. This is why Aristotle thinks young people can learn mathematics but cannot really grasp ethics. They lack the life experience necessary to understand human situations in their full complexity. They haven't observed enough cases to recognize patterns. They haven't faced enough difficult choices to develop sound judgment. Practical wisdom cannot be learned from books alone, but must be cultivated through years of living and reflecting on experience. The practically wise person has developed a kind of perceptual sensitivity to ethically salient features of situations. They notice aspects of situations that less experienced people miss. They see that this particular case, while superficially similar to others, has morally relevant differences. They recognize when general rules must be qualified or even set aside to serve their underlying purposes. This sensitivity cannot be captured in explicit rules, but emerges from immersion in ethical practice. Aristotle compares practical wisdom to skills like navigation or medicine. The skilled navigator knows general principles of seamanship, but they must apply these flexibly in light of current winds, tides, and circumstances. The physician knows medical theory, but must diagnose and treat each patient individually, considering their particular constitution and condition. Similarly, the practically wise person knows ethical principles, but applies them sensitively to particular situations. This emphasis on practical wisdom has important implications for moral education. We don't learn ethics primarily by memorizing rules or studying theories. We learn by practicing virtuous actions under the guidance of good role models, gradually developing the judgment necessary to recognize what each situation requires. Habituation and experience matter more than theoretical knowledge. The goal is to develop the kind of character that spontaneously responds appropriately, not to become skilled at applying algorithms. Yet practical wisdom is not mere intuition or gut feeling. It involves deliberation, reasoning about what actions might achieve our ends and which ends are truly worth pursuing. The phronimos reasons from ends to means, considering what actions would promote flourishing given current circumstances. This deliberation is structured and rational, not arbitrary, even if it cannot be reduced to deductive logic. Aristotle's account raises difficult questions about moral knowledge and objectivity. If ethics depends so heavily on judgment and cannot be reduced to universal rules, does this mean ethical truth is relative or subjective? Aristotle would say no. There are objective facts about what promotes human flourishing, about what virtues are, about what actions tend toward good or bad ends. But grasping these truths requires practical wisdom developed through experience, not just theoretical cleverness. This has implications for moral disagreement. People of goodwill and intelligence can disagree about ethical matters, because practical judgment is difficult and context-dependent. Such disagreements don't necessarily mean ethics is merely subjective. Rather, they reflect the complexity of human situations and the challenges of developing practical wisdom. Some people have better judgment than others because they've cultivated the relevant virtues more successfully. Modern ethical theories often try to avoid reliance on practical wisdom by providing decision procedures, algorithms that generate correct answers mechanically. Utilitarians calculate greatest happiness. Kantians apply the categorical imperative. Such theories promise moral guidance without requiring the difficult work of character development and experiential learning. But Aristotle would say they're chasing an illusion. Ethics cannot be mechanized because human life is too complex and context-dependent. This doesn't mean general principles are useless. They provide guidance and structure our thinking, but they must be applied wisely, with attention to particular circumstances and exceptions. The mean between extremes must be found for each person in each situation. Rules about truth-telling must be qualified to handle situations where honesty would cause terrible harm. Principles of justice must be adapted to different political and economic contexts. Though Aristotle never wrote a systematic treatise on language, his works contain sophisticated analyses of meaning, reference, truth, and the relationship between language and reality. These insights foundationally shaped Western philosophy of language and remain relevant to contemporary debates. Aristotle recognized that language is fundamentally conventional rather than natural. Words don't resemble what they signify. There's nothing dog-like about the sound, dog. Different languages use different sounds for the same things, showing that linguistic meaning depends on human convention and agreement. Yet language isn't arbitrary in a deeper sense, because it must be answerable to reality to function successfully. The basic units of meaning are words, which Aristotle analyzes in terms of their signification. A word signifies a concept in the mind, which in turn represents something in reality. This three-part structure word, concept, reality, becomes standard in medieval and modern philosophy of language. Words don't directly attach to things but are mediated by mental concepts or meanings. But individual words don't express complete thoughts or have truth values. Only combinations of words in statements can be true or false. The simplest statements combine a subject and a predicate. Socrates is wise, the dog is sleeping. Such statements assert that something, the subject, possesses some property or characteristic, the predicate. Truth consists in this correspondence holding, the predicate actually applying to the subject. This seems simple, but Aristotle recognized complications. Some statements are about the past or present and are determinately true or false. Socrates drank hemlock is either true or false depending on whether this event occurred. But what about statements concerning contingent future events? There will be a sea battle tomorrow. Seems neither definitely true nor definitely false, because the future is open and undetermined. This raises the problem of future contingents, which puzzled philosophers for centuries. If there will be a sea battle tomorrow is already true or false, doesn't this mean the future is already determined? But if it has no truth value, doesn't this violate logical principles? Aristotle's solution was subtle. Such statements are necessarily either true or false, excluded middle holds. But neither is necessarily true nor necessarily false. Neither has its truth value necessarily. Aristotle also analyzed different types of predication corresponding to his categories. Socrates is human, makes a substantial predication. It identifies what kind of thing Socrates is. Socrates is pale, makes a qualitative predication. It describes an accidental property. Socrates is in Athens, makes a locational predication. Different types of predication have different logical properties and answer different questions. Definition receives careful attention as the special type of predication that reveals essence. A good definition states genus and specific difference, identifying both the broader category to which something belongs and what distinguishes it within that category. Such definitions capture what things truly are, rather than merely describing accidental features. They allow us to understand necessity. why things must have certain properties given what they essentially are. Aristotle recognized that some terms are ambiguous. They have multiple distinct meanings. Healthy applies to organisms, food, exercise, and complexion, but in importantly different ways. An organism is healthy by possessing health. Food is healthy by producing health. Exercise is healthy by maintaining health. These meanings are related but distinct. Recognizing this prevents logical confusions. He distinguished homonymy, equivocation, where the same word has completely unrelated meanings, from synonymous, univocation, where the same word has exactly the same meaning, and a middle category, sometimes called focal meaning, where related meanings derive from a central case. Bank. Financial institution versus riverside is homonymous. Animal, applied to cats and dogs, is synonymous. Healthy shows focal meaning. All uses relate to the central case of health in living organisms. This analysis of focal meaning became important for metaphysics. Being is not homonymous, pure equivocation, but neither is it synonymous, having exactly the same meaning in all cases. Rather, being has focal meaning. Substance is the primary case, while qualities, quantities, and relations are called beings derivatively, because they exist in or are predicated of substances. This allows Aristotle to maintain that metaphysics is unified, while recognizing that being is said in many ways. Metaphor receives attention as a particularly powerful linguistic device. Good metaphors work by revealing genuine similarities between dissimilar things, allowing us to see familiar things in new ways or grasp unfamiliar things through comparison to the familiar. Metaphor isn't mere decoration, but a tool for discovery and understanding. Aristotle's own writing employs metaphor extensively. Form in matter, potentiality, becoming actuality. The unmoved mover as object of love. Aristotle wasn't content with investigating particular domains in isolation. He wanted to understand how different branches of knowledge relate to each other and to systematically organize human understanding. His classification of sciences shaped academic organization for centuries and raises enduring questions about the unity and diversity of knowledge. The fundamental division separates theoretical, practical, and productive sciences according to their aims. Theoretical sciences seek knowledge for its own sake, understanding reality simply because it's worth understanding. Practical sciences seek knowledge for the sake of action, understanding how to live well, an organized society. Productive sciences seek knowledge for the sake of making things, creating useful or beautiful objects through craft. Within theoretical science, Aristotle distinguishes three main divisions, based on their subject matter and degree of abstraction. Physics, natural philosophy, studies natural beings, things that have internal principles of motion and change. This includes all of nature, living organisms, the elements, celestial bodies, and their motions. Physics abstracts from particular materials, but studies bodies insofar as they are capable of motion. Mathematics studies quantity and spatial relations abstracted from physical matter. The mathematician doesn't care whether triangles are made of bronze or wood. Only their geometrical properties matter. Mathematical objects don't exist separately from physical things, contra Plato, but we can study them in abstraction from matter, considering only their quantitative and spatial characteristics. First philosophy, metaphysics, studies being qua being, not this or that particular type of being, but what it means to be at all. It investigates the most universal principles, the ultimate causes, and the highest kinds of beings. Metaphysics is more abstract and universal than physics because it's not limited to changeable natural beings but considers being in general. It's also the highest science because it grasps first principles and ultimate causes, including the unmoved mover. Aristotle ranks these sciences by their level of certainty, necessity, and dignity. Mathematics achieves great certainty because it deals with necessary relationships. Metaphysics is the highest and most divine science because it grasps the ultimate principles and the divine, unmoved mover. Physics is less certain because natural phenomena admit of exceptions and irregularity. Yet physics has its own dignity because it studies the natural world that surrounds and sustains us. Within physics, Aristotle recognizes multiple subordinate sciences corresponding to different aspects of natural reality. Biology studies living organisms. Psychology studies the soul and its functions. Meteorology studies atmospheric phenomena. Astronomy studies celestial motions. Each special science has its own proper principles and methods suited to its domain. The practical sciences include ethics and politics. Ethics studies individual human action and character, what it means to live well as a person. Politics studies collective human life, how communities should be organized to promote flourishing. Aristotle considers politics more comprehensive than ethics because it includes ethics, but also addresses broader questions of law, education, war, and peace. The political science is the architectonic practical science that guides all others. The productive sciences include rhetoric, poetics, medicine, agriculture, and all the various crafts and arts. These seek not understanding for its own sake, but knowledge that enables effective production of useful or beautiful things. They're less theoretical than the practical sciences, more concerned with technique than with wisdom about ends. This classification raises important questions. How unified is human knowledge? Can all sciences be reduced to one fundamental science, or are they irreducibly plural? Aristotle believed in the unity of truth, reality as one, and true knowledge must ultimately be consistent. But he also recognized that different domains require different methods and explanatory approaches. Mathematics explains differently than physics, and physics explains differently than ethics. The relationship between higher and lower sciences is complex. In some sense, metaphysics grounds all other sciences because it establishes first principles. But metaphysics also depends on the special sciences for much of its content. Metaphysical conclusions are often derived from examining what physics, mathematics, and other sciences reveal about reality. Knowledge forms a systematic whole, but not a strictly hierarchical deduction from first principles. Modern science has abandoned much of Aristotle's specific content, but retained something of his organizational spirit. We still distinguish theoretical from applied science. We recognize that different domains require specialized methods and concepts. We value both unity, seeking general laws, and plurality, respecting the distinctive features of different phenomena. We struggle with the same questions about reduction and emergence that Aristotle grappled with. Among Aristotle's most sophisticated and enduringly relevant contributions are his analyses of time, infinity, and continuity. These investigations show his analytical power at its height, addressing concepts that seem simple on the surface, but reveal extraordinary complexity upon careful examination. Time puzzled Aristotle deeply. What is it? It seems real. We experience temporal passage, measure durations, distinguish past from future. Yet time also seems peculiar. The past no longer exists. The future doesn't exist yet. The present is merely the moving boundary between non-existent past and non-existent future. If past, present, and future are all that time consists of, and past and future don't exist while present is merely a boundary, how can time itself exist? Aristotle's solution connected time to motion and change. Time is the measure of motion with respect to before and after. Wherever there is change, something moving, growing, altering, there is time. Time provides the metric by which we measure how much change has occurred. The now, that divides past from future, is like a point moving along a line, continuously marking the present phase of ongoing motion. This doesn't make time subjective or mental, though consciousness is required to actually perform measurements. Time exists in nature as an aspect of change itself, not just in minds observing change. The regular motions of celestial bodies provide objective measures that make calendars and clocks possible. Yet without minds to count and measure, time wouldn't be fully actual as a number or measure. Could time exist without change? Aristotle thought not. If absolutely nothing changed, including our own mental states, we wouldn't experience time passing. We only notice time's passage by noticing change. Complete changelessness would mean no time. Conversely, if time exists, some change must be occurring somewhere in the universe. This raised a question about the unmoved mover. Does God exist in time if God never changes? Aristotle's answer was subtle. The unmoved mover exists eternally, but not temporally. Eternity is not infinite time, but timeless existence, the complete possession of unlimited life all at once. The unmoved mover doesn't endure through time, but simply is, with no distinction between past, present, and future in divine existence. Aristotle's treatment of infinity was equally sophisticated. He distinguished potential from actual infinity. An actual infinity would be a completed infinite magnitude or collection, an infinitely large body, or a set with infinitely many members all existing simultaneously. Aristotle denied that actual infinities exist. No physical magnitude is infinitely large. No collection contains infinitely many members all at once. Why reject actual infinity? Several arguments. An infinitely large body would fill all of space, leaving no room for anything else and no possibility of motion. An infinite magnitude couldn't have a center or boundaries, yet we observe that physical things do have centers and boundaries. Mathematical arguments seem to generate paradoxes when actual infinities were assumed. The world must be finite. But Aristotle accepted potential infinity processes that can continue without limit. You can always divide a line segment further. You can always add another number. Time can continue endlessly into the future. These infinities exist potentially, in the sense that the process can always continue, but never actually as completed totalities. This distinction proved influential, but also problematic. Is it coherent to accept potential infinity while denying actual infinity? If you can always divide further, doesn't this mean the line contains infinitely many potential division points? If time continues endlessly, doesn't this require infinitely many future moments? Later, mathematicians would develop theories of actual infinity that Aristotle had rejected, finding them mathematically fruitful rather than paradoxical. Continuity posed related puzzles. A continuous magnitude, like a line or a period of time, is infinitely divisible. You can always divide it further into smaller parts. But what are continuous magnitudes made of? Not indivisible points, because points have no magnitude. Adding up points, no matter how many, cannot yield extended magnitudes. Rather, continuous things are composed of continuous parts, divisible all the way down. This has implications for motion. Motion cannot be composed of indivisible moments of rest, as Zeno had suggested. Rather, motion is continuous change through continuous space over continuous time. At any instant, a moving object is neither at one point nor having moved to another point. It is in transition, a state that cannot be captured by any static description. Aristotle used these analyses to refute Zeno's famous paradoxes of motion. Achilles can catch the tortoise because the infinite series of distances he must traverse constitutes a finite total distance, traversable in finite time. The arrow in flight is moving, not resting, at each instant. Its state, at an instant, is not the same as rest. The paradoxes arise from wrongly treating continuous magnitudes, as if composed of discrete, indivisible units. Understanding Aristotle's theory of causation is essential for grasping his entire philosophical system. His four causes provide a comprehensive framework for explaining why things are as they are, and why events occur as they do. This framework shaped scientific thinking for centuries and raises enduring questions about explanation and understanding. Modern readers often find Aristotle's usage of cause strange. We typically think of causes as events that produce effects. The spark causes the fire, the collision causes the injury. But Aristotle's concept of aetia, usually translated as cause, but perhaps better rendered as explanatory factor or reason why, is much broader. A complete explanation might invoke all four types of causes working together. Material cause explains what something is made from, the matter that constitutes it. The bronze is the material cause of the statue, the bricks of the house, the flesh and bone of the living organism. Without matter, physical things couldn't exist. But matter alone doesn't explain why this particular thing exists, rather than something else made from the same matter. Formal cause explains what makes something the kind of thing it is, its essence, structure, or defining characteristics. The form of the statue makes it represent a human figure rather than being a shapeless lump. The form of the house makes it a shelter rather than a pile of bricks. The form of the living organism makes it the particular species it is, rather than just organic matter. Efficient cause explains what brought something into existence, the agent or process that initiated change. The sculptor is the efficient cause of the statue, the builders of the house, the parents of the child. This comes closest to our modern notion of cause as productive agent. But for Aristotle, efficient causes often work toward ends, which brings in the fourth type. Final cause explains the purpose or goal toward which something tends, what it's for, or what it aims at. The statue exists to honor a deity. The house exists to provide shelter. The eye exists to see. Natural processes tend toward ends. The acorn grows toward being an oak. The animal's heart beats to circulate blood. Human action aims at happiness. This fourfold analysis allows rich explanations that integrate multiple perspectives. Why does this bronze statue exist? Material cause, it's made of bronze. Formal cause, it has the form of Hermes. Efficient cause, the sculptor made it. Final cause, it honors the god and beautifies the temple. Each type of cause contributes to complete understanding. Aristotle insisted that nature operates teleologically toward ends and goals. This is his most controversial claim, and the one modern science most decisively rejected. Natural processes seem purposeless, directed only by efficient causation and natural laws. Teleology seems to anthropomorphize nature, illegitimately reading purpose into blind mechanisms. But Aristotle wasn't anthropomorphizing. He didn't think acorns consciously intend to become oaks, or that hearts deliberately choose to pump blood. Rather, he observed that natural processes are directional and regular. Seeds reliably grow into mature organisms of their kind. Organs consistently perform specific functions. Natural processes that would be incredibly unlikely if random occur with remarkable regularity. This regularity suggests inherent directedness, built-in tendencies towards specific outcomes. Modern biology partially vindicates Aristotle's intuition, even if rejecting his metaphysics. We can't understand biological systems without functional explanation. identifying what organs and processes are for, what purposes they serve in the organism's life. The heart pumps blood, the eye sees, the immune system fights infection. These aren't just descriptions, but explanations appealing to function and purpose. Still, modern biology explains teleology through efficient causation. Natural selection shapes organisms toward functional effectiveness without invoking irreducible purposes. Features that serve survival and reproduction are selected for, those that don't are selected against. The appearance of purpose emerges from blind mechanical processes. Aristotle would respond that even evolutionary explanations presuppose natural regularities and inherent potentials that his framework better captures. Why do organisms reliably produce offspring similar to themselves? Why do genetic variations follow patterns rather than being completely random? Why does natural selection consistently produce adaptations? These regularities suggest nature isn't as purposeless as strict mechanism implies. His broader point remains relevant. Complete explanation requires multiple perspectives. Even if we can describe how things happen through efficient causation, we might still need to explain what they're made of, material, what kinds of things they are, formal, and what functions they serve, final. Reductionism, that tries to explain everything through one type of cause, impoverishes our understanding. Aristotle's treatment of pleasure represents one of his most psychologically sophisticated analyses, offering insights that remain relevant to contemporary ethics and psychology. Against those who condemn pleasure as bad and those who identified it with the good, Aristotle developed a nuanced account that recognizes pleasure's complexity. Pleasure is not the good, as hedonists claimed. We value many things independently of pleasure, knowledge, virtue, friendship, and we choose them even if they brought no pleasure. Moreover, pleasures differ in kind and value. The pleasure of learning differs from the pleasure of eating, which differs from the pleasure of sadistic cruelty. Not all pleasures are good or choice-worthy, but pleasure isn't bad either, as ascetics maintained. Pleasure is natural and good when experienced in the right way toward the right objects. The pleasure that comes from virtuous activity is good and confirms that we're flourishing. The person who doesn't enjoy acting virtuously hasn't fully achieved virtue. They're still struggling against contrary inclinations, rather than having transformed their character. What exactly is pleasure? Aristotle offered two related accounts. First, pleasure is the unimpeded activity of a natural state. When our faculties function well without obstruction, we experience pleasure. The eye seeing clearly, the mind understanding successfully, the body moving freely. These unimpeded activities are pleasant. Second, pleasure completes or perfects activity. It's not identical with the activity itself, but supervenes upon it when the activity proceeds well. Just as beauty might complete or enhance a face without being identical to the face itself, pleasure completes good activity without being identical to that activity. When we're performing well at what we're doing, pleasure naturally arises. This means pleasures differ according to the activities they complete. The pleasure of philosophical contemplation differs from the pleasure of athletic competition, which differs from sensory pleasures. Each activity has its characteristic pleasure when performed well. We can't assume all pleasures are commensurable, or that more pleasure is always better regardless of source. Pleasures can be classified as higher or lower, better or worse, according to the activities they complete. Activities using our distinctively human rational capacities produce higher pleasures than merely animal sensory pleasures. The pleasure of understanding a difficult proof surpasses the pleasure of eating dessert, because theoretical reasoning is a higher activity than digestion. But Aristotle wasn't a killjoy who dismissed bodily pleasures. He recognized that physical pleasures are natural and necessary. Problems arise when we pursue them excessively or make them our primary goal. The temperate person enjoys food, drink, and sex, but in moderation at appropriate times, toward appropriate objects. They don't make bodily pleasure their highest aim. Pain requires similar analysis. It's not simply the opposite of pleasure, but indicates impeded or damaged functioning. When we're hungry, injured, or sick, pain signals that something is wrong and motivates us to address the problem. In this sense, pain serves important functions, even though we naturally avoid it. The intemperate person's relationship to pleasure is disordered. They pursue bodily pleasures excessively, making them central to their life plan. They experience pleasure from the wrong objects or in the wrong ways. They can't control their appetites even when they know they should. This disorder makes them miserable, constantly craving satisfaction while never achieving lasting contentment. The incontinent person knows what they should do but can't control their appetites when temptation strikes. They experience genuine internal conflict. Their reason says one thing, but their desires overcome their judgment. Aristotle considers incontinence a moral failing, but less severe than intemperance, because the incontinent person at least recognizes the good, even if they can't consistently achieve it. The continent person successfully controls contrary appetites through willpower. They resist temptation and do what virtue requires despite experiencing opposing desires. But continence isn't full virtue because it involves struggle. The fully virtuous person has transformed their desires so they spontaneously want what's good. They don't experience the conflict that requires continence. This analysis illuminates motivation and self-control. Why do we sometimes fail to do what we know we should? Not always from ignorance of the good, as Socrates claimed, but from weak will, contrary desires, or disordered appetites. Achieving virtue requires not just knowing the good, but training our desires so we consistently choose and enjoy what's truly good. At the pinnacle of Aristotle's ethics stands contemplation, theoria, the intellectual activity of understanding for its own sake. This represents the highest form of human happiness and the activity most similar to divine life. Yet this teaching creates tensions with his more practical emphasis on virtue and community, raising questions about how contemplation fits into a flourishing human life. Why does Aristotle elevate contemplation above all other activities? Several arguments converge. First, contemplation exercises our most distinctive and excellent capacity, reason in its highest form. While practical wisdom applies reason to action and production, theoretical wisdom grasps truths for their own sake. Understanding reality simply because it's worth understanding represents reason's purest exercise. Second, contemplation is most self-sufficient. Other activities require external goods, cooperative partners, or favorable circumstances. But the philosopher can contemplate alone, needing little beyond basic sustenance and freedom from distraction. The contemplative life depends least on fortune's cooperation. Third, contemplation is most continuous. We cannot act courageously or generously constantly. Such activities require occasions and intervals. But we can contemplate for extended periods, as long as our mental stamina allows. The more continuous the activity, the more complete the happiness it provides. Fourth, contemplation is loved for itself, rather than for results it produces. We act justly to be just and benefit others. We engage in politics to create good societies, but we contemplate simply because understanding is intrinsically valuable. This makes contemplative activity most choice-worthy in itself. Fifth, contemplation is most pleasant. While all excellent activity brings pleasure, intellectual discovery provides particularly pure and lasting satisfaction. The pleasure of understanding surpasses sensory pleasures in stability and depth. Sixth, contemplation is most divine. The gods, being perfect, cannot engage in practical action. They have no needs requiring satisfaction. no external situations demanding response, but they can eternally contemplate truth. When we philosophize, we engage in activity most similar to divine life and participate in something immortal and divine. This elevation of contemplation seems to contradict Aristotle's earlier emphasis on moral virtue, political engagement, and practical wisdom. If contemplation is the highest good, why should we care about courage, justice, or effective citizenship? Should philosophers withdraw from practical affairs to maximize contemplative time? Aristotle never fully resolves this tension, but several points mitigate the conflict. First, the contemplative life still requires moral virtue. We need justice, temperance, and other virtues to maintain the social conditions enabling sustained study. We need courage to face intellectual difficulties. We need the social virtues to maintain relationships with fellow philosophers and supporters. Second, contemplation remains a human activity requiring a human life. We have bodies that need care, relationships that require maintenance, communities that deserve our participation. Pure contemplation belongs to God's alone. Human happiness must integrate theoretical wisdom with practical excellence. Third, contemplation need not be solitary. Aristotle emphasizes that philosophical activity is enhanced when shared with friends. Discussing ideas, teaching others, learning from fellow inquirers. These make philosophy more pleasant and productive. The contemplative life includes philosophical community. Fourth, contemplation provides perspective that improves practical judgment. Understanding universal principles, seeing particular situations in broader contexts, grasping necessary relationships. These theoretical insights can inform practical decisions. The philosopher who engages with the world brings theoretical wisdom to bear on practical problems. Still, tension remains. Aristotle seems to suggest that if we could live purely contemplative lives, that would be most choice-worthy. But since we're human, not divine, we must compromise, balancing contemplation with practical engagement. The best human life maximizes contemplation while fulfilling necessary practical obligations. This teaching has been interpreted variously. Some read Aristotle as a thoroughgoing intellectualist, subordinating everything to theoretical wisdom. Others emphasize his practical side, treating contemplation as merely one component of comprehensive flourishing. Medieval philosophers debated whether the contemplative or active life was superior, often seeing Aristotle as championing contemplation while Christianity valued both. The contemporary relevance is clear. In an age that values practical results and measurable outcomes, Aristotle reminds us that understanding for its own sake has intrinsic worth. Not everything must be useful or productive. The life of the mind pursuing truth, exploring ideas, understanding reality, represents a distinctively human excellence worth cultivating, regardless of practical benefits. Though Aristotle never wrote a systematic treatise on education, his works contain rich insights about learning, teaching, and human development. His views on education follow naturally from his ethics and psychology. If virtue must be cultivated through habituation and intellectual excellence through study, then education becomes central to human flourishing. Education begins with the formation of good habits. Children aren't born virtuous, but acquire virtue through repeatedly performing virtuous actions guided by parents and teachers. Before they can understand ethical principles rationally, they must be trained in good behavior through practice. This habituation shapes their desires and emotional responses, preparing them for later rational understanding. This early training requires authority and discipline. Children lack the experience and judgment to direct themselves wisely. They need adult guidance to develop proper habits before they can exercise autonomous judgment. But this authority should aim at eventual autonomy. The goal is to produce adults who choose virtue freely, not children who obey mechanically. The content of early education should include music, gymnastics, and basic literacy. Music educates the emotions, training children to feel appropriate emotional responses. Gymnastics develops physical health and self-discipline. Reading and writing provide tools for later learning. But the goal isn't merely skill acquisition, it's character formation through well-rounded development. As students mature, education becomes more intellectual. They study mathematics, which trains logical thinking and reveals necessary truths. They study natural science, learning about the physical world through observation and reasoning. They study ethics and politics, understanding how to live well individually and collectively. They might pursue specialized studies in medicine, rhetoric, or other fields according to their talents and interests. Throughout, education should balance theoretical and practical knowledge. Pure theory without practical application produces useless pedants. Pure practice without theoretical understanding produces narrow technicians. The educated person combines breadth of knowledge with depth in particular areas, theoretical insight with practical wisdom. Teaching requires understanding how learning occurs. We learn through moving from what's more familiar to us towards what's more familiar in nature. Children learn concrete particulars before abstract universals. Students grasp examples before principles. Good teachers begin with familiar cases and gradually lead students toward more abstract and universal understanding. Demonstration proving conclusions from first principles represents the highest form of teaching in theoretical subjects. But reaching first principles requires induction from particular observations. We build up to general principles by observing many cases, then demonstrate particular truths by deducing them from established principles. Both inductive and deductive reasoning play essential roles. Different subjects require different pedagogical approaches. Mathematics can be taught systematically through formal proofs. Natural science requires observation and empirical investigation. Ethics cannot be mastered by youth because it requires life experience. Philosophy demands intellectual maturity and sustained contemplative practice. The relationship between teacher and student is crucial. Good teachers don't simply transmit information, but guide students toward understanding. They ask questions that prompt students to think through problems themselves. They provide examples that illuminate principles. They correct errors while encouraging continued inquiry. Teaching is an art requiring both knowledge of subject matter and understanding of human psychology. Education serves both individual and social purposes. Individually, it enables people to develop their capacities and achieve flourishing. Socially, it produces virtuous citizens capable of participating effectively in communal life. Well-educated citizens make better political decisions, contribute more to society, and help maintain just institutions. This gives the polis legitimate interest in education. While families bear primary responsibility for early moral training, the community should ensure all citizens receive education appropriate to their roles. Laws should mandate basic education and establish institutions that promote learning. A society's quality depends largely on how well it educates its youth. But education doesn't end with youth. Philosophical wisdom requires lifelong learning. Practical wisdom develops through years of experience and reflection. The educated person continues growing intellectually and morally throughout life, never assuming they've achieved complete understanding or perfect virtue. Aristotle's educational vision remains compelling. Education should cultivate both intellectual and moral excellence through appropriate methods at each developmental stage, preparing people for lives of engaged citizenship and philosophical contemplation, serving both individual flourishing and the common good. A recurring tension in Aristotle's philosophy concerns the relationship between unity and plurality, universal and particular, general principles and concrete cases. His resolution of these tensions reveals the sophistication and balance of his thought. Unlike Plato, who sought ultimate unity in the world of forms, Aristotle embraced irreducible plurality. Reality consists of many distinct substances, many different kinds of beings, many irreducible categories. This plurality isn't mere appearance to be overcome by grasping underlying unity. It's the fundamental structure of reality itself. Yet Aristotle also recognized genuine unity. Individual substances are unified wholes, not mere aggregates of independent parts. Each substance has a single form that organizes its matter into one being. Species and genera represent real unities in nature. All humans share a common nature that makes them the same kind of thing despite individual differences. The tension appears clearly in his metaphysics. Being is said in many ways: substance, quality, quantity, relation, and other categories. These are not reducible to one another or to some more fundamental unity. Yet being isn't purely equivocal either. All modes of being relate to substance as the primary case. This focal meaning preserves both plurality and unity. Similarly, with causation, Aristotle doesn't reduce all explanation to one type of cause, but recognizes four distinct types. Yet these aren't unrelated. In natural substances, formal and final causes often coincide. The form of an eye is defined by its function of seeing. Material and formal causes work together. The form can only be realized in appropriate matter. Plurality of causes doesn't preclude their coordination. His ethics shows similar balance. Virtues are many and distinct: courage, temperance, justice, wisdom. Each has its own sphere of action and characteristic mean, yet they're unified in the virtuous person, whose character is a harmonious whole. Someone lacking one virtue likely lacks them all, because true virtue requires practical wisdom that informs all virtuous action. The various sciences investigate different domains with different methods and principles. Physics, mathematics, and metaphysics can't be reduced to one another. Yet they're not completely separate. Metaphysics grounds all sciences by establishing first principles, while special sciences provide content that metaphysics systematizes. This balance between unity and plurality reflects Aristotle's empirical realism. He respects the diversity and complexity of actual experience rather than imposing artificial unity. The world really contains many irreducibly different kinds of things and properties. But he also recognizes real unities, individuals, species, causal connections that make reality intelligible rather than chaotic. The implications extend to methodology. We cannot investigate everything using the same method or expect the same degree of precision in all domains. Ethics isn't mathematics. Biology isn't logic. Each domain requires methods appropriate to its subject matter. Methodological pluralism follows from ontological plurality. Yet knowledge forms a systematic whole. Different sciences contribute to comprehensive understanding of reality. Truths discovered in one domain constrain possibilities in others. Reality's diversity doesn't preclude rational intelligibility. Rather, respecting genuine differences enables better understanding than forced unification would provide. This stance contrasts with both reductive monism, which tries to explain everything through one fundamental principle, and radical pluralism, which denies any unity or commensurability across domains. Aristotle charts a middle path. Reality is irreducibly complex, but systematically connected, requiring multiple perspectives that nonetheless cohere into unified understanding. No philosophical system, however brilliant, is without flaws and limitations. Examining Aristotle's errors and the valid criticisms raised against him helps us appreciate both his genuine achievements and the progress philosophy and science have made since his time. His physics, once dominant for centuries, is now known to be fundamentally wrong in many respects. Heavy objects don't fall faster than light ones. Galileo showed this experimentally. There is no absolute natural place toward which elements tend. The distinction between terrestrial and celestial matter is false. The same physical laws govern both. Violent and natural motion aren't different in kind. Much of Aristotelian physics had to be completely replaced, not merely revised. His cosmology fares no better. Earth isn't the center of the universe. Celestial bodies aren't carried by crystalline spheres. The heavens do change and decay. The universe isn't finitely bounded by a sphere of fixed stars. Modern astronomy and physics vindicated Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton against Aristotle's cosmology. His biology, though impressive in many ways, contains serious errors. Spontaneous generation doesn't occur. The heart isn't the seat of consciousness. The brain is. Many anatomical and physiological claims are wrong. His embryology incorrectly describes development. While his observational work was often excellent, his theoretical framework couldn't anticipate modern genetics, cell theory, or evolution. His logic, though groundbreaking and long dominant, has limitations recognized by modern logicians. Syllogistic logic can't capture all valid forms of reasoning. It can't handle relations adequately. It lacks resources for dealing with multiple quantifiers or complex mathematical reasoning. Modern symbolic logic extends far beyond Aristotelian logic's capabilities. His metaphysics faces persistent objections. The distinction between substance and accident seems unclear in many cases. His account of change and potentiality raises puzzles about whether potential being is real being. His theory of categories has been questioned. Are these really the fundamental ways being is said? His rejection of actual infinity limits mathematics in ways most mathematicians now reject. His ethics, while influential, faces criticisms. The doctrine of the mean seems vague and difficult to apply. How do we determine the mean in particular situations? His teleological conception of human nature seems to assume an essence that evolutionary biology calls into question. His treatment of women and slaves as naturally inferior is morally repugnant. His elevation of contemplation over practical engagement seems elitist. His politics reflects the limitations of his time and culture. He accepted slavery as natural, rather than recognizing it as a profound injustice. He viewed women as naturally subordinate to men. He couldn't imagine political communities larger than city-states. He had no conception of universal human rights. Many of his political recommendations were tailored to Greek city-states and don't generalize well. Methodologically, he sometimes failed to follow his own empirical principles. He often accepted traditional beliefs or plausible-sounding theories without sufficient empirical testing. He sometimes allowed teleological assumptions to override empirical evidence. His science mixed careful observation with speculative metaphysics in ways that impeded progress. His style created problems for later reception. His treatises weren't meant for publication, but were teaching notes, making them difficult and sometimes obscure. Different works sometimes seem inconsistent. His technical terminology was often adapted from ordinary Greek in ways that made translation difficult and interpretation contested. Yet, recognizing these limitations shouldn't diminish appreciation for Aristotle's genuine achievements. He created multiple fields of inquiry from scratch. He established methodological standards that shaped scientific investigation for centuries. He asked questions and identified problems that remained central to philosophy. He combined empirical rigor with systematic ambition in unprecedented ways. Moreover, Some apparent errors reflect different concepts rather than simple mistakes. When Aristotle said heavy objects fall faster, he was partly defining heavy differently than we do. When he emphasized final causation, he was capturing real features of biological organization that reductive mechanisms struggled to explain. When he prioritized substance, he was recognizing genuine facts about the structure of reality. The test of a philosopher's greatness isn't whether later thinkers proved them wrong. Everyone is eventually superseded. Rather, it's whether their work advanced understanding, raised important questions, and provided conceptual tools that remain useful. By these standards, Aristotle ranks among the very greatest, despite his many errors. More than 2 millennia after his death, Aristotle remains vitally relevant to contemporary philosophy, science, and human self-understanding. While much of his specific content has been superseded, his approaches, questions, and insights continue to shape intellectual inquiry. In metaphysics, contemporary philosophers still grapple with Aristotelian questions. What is the relationship between substances and properties, objects and qualities? How do we understand persistence through change? What makes something the kind of thing it is? How do parts compose wholes? These questions, first systematically addressed by Aristotle, remain central to metaphysical inquiry. His distinction between actuality and potentiality has been revived by some metaphysicians seeking alternatives to purely static conceptions of reality. His emphasis on substance as the primary mode of being influences debates about fundamental ontology. His functional essentialism, defining things by their characteristic activities, resonates with some contemporary approaches to natural kinds. In philosophy of science, debates about reduction and emergence echo Aristotelian themes. Can biology be reduced to chemistry and physics, or does it require autonomous principles and explanatory strategies? Aristotle's recognition that different sciences need different methods seems vindicated by irreducibility claims in biology, psychology, and social sciences. His emphasis on teleological explanation in biology has found surprising support. While rejecting Aristotelian metaphysics, many philosophers of biology argue that functional explanation is indispensable for understanding living systems. We cannot fully explain biological traits without asking what they're for and how they contribute to survival and reproduction. In ethics, virtue ethics has undergone major revival as an alternative to consequentialist and deontological theories. Contemporary virtue ethicists develop Aristotelian themes: the centrality of character, the importance of the virtues, the role of practical wisdom, the connection between virtue and flourishing. While updating Aristotle's views, they recognize his framework's continuing power. His emphasis on human nature as the foundation for ethics remains controversial but influential. If humans have a characteristic function or set of capacities, this might ground objective claims about human flourishing. While evolutionary biology complicates talk of fixed human nature, it doesn't eliminate questions about what ways of life suit creatures with our cognitive and emotional architecture. His political philosophy influences communitarian critiques of liberalism. His insight that humans are political animals whose good is inherently social challenges, individualistic approaches to political theory. His emphasis on cultivating virtue through law and education suggests that states have legitimate interest in promoting character, not just protecting rights. In philosophy of mind, some contemporary thinkers find Aristotelian hylomorphism attractive as an alternative to both dualism and reductive materialism. If mind is the form of the living body, its organizational principle, we might avoid treating consciousness as either a separate substance or mere epiphenomenon. This neo-Aristotelian approach remains controversial, but garners serious attention. His philosophy of language and logic continues to influence analytic philosophy. His careful attention to ordinary language, his analysis of different types of predication, his treatment of categories, these remain relevant to philosophical methodology. While formal logic has advanced far beyond his syllogistic system, his insights about language and meaning retain value. His emphasis on teleology, while rejected by physics, resonates with some contemporary philosophy of mind and action theory. Intentional explanation, understanding behavior in terms of goals and purposes, seems indispensable for psychology and social sciences. We cannot fully understand human action without considering what agents intend and aim at. His recognition that different domains require different explanatory approaches, methodological pluralism, seems increasingly vindicated. The dream of reducing all sciences to fundamental physics has proven elusive. Each special science maintains some autonomy, using concepts and explanatory patterns appropriate to its domain, just as Aristotle suggested. Beyond specific doctrines, Aristotle's broader intellectual virtues remain exemplary. His empirical attentiveness, his willingness to examine diverse opinions carefully before judging, his systematic ambition, his balance between respect for common sense and theoretical sophistication, his integration of multiple perspectives, these methodological commitments continue to inspire. Perhaps most fundamentally, Aristotle reminds us that philosophy should address the full range of human concerns. Ethics, politics, aesthetics, logic, metaphysics, natural science, psychology, all deserve philosophical attention. Philosophy shouldn't retreat into narrow specialization, but should maintain comprehensive ambition to understand reality and human life in all their dimensions. His conviction that theoretical and practical wisdom both matter remains vital. We need both understanding for its own sake and wisdom about how to live. Neither should be sacrificed to the other. The best human life integrates contemplation with action, thought with practice, individual flourishing with communal engagement. In an age of increasing specialization and fragmentation, Aristotle's example of comprehensive philosophical inquiry offers an alternative vision. His work demonstrates that it's possible to be both rigorously empirical and broadly systematic, both analytically precise and humanistically rich, both scientifically minded and ethically engaged. The questions Aristotle asked, what is being? What is knowledge? What is the good life? How should we organize society? What is the relationship between body and soul? What causes natural phenomena? Remain our questions. His answers may often be wrong, but his questions continue to structure philosophical inquiry. This is perhaps the truest measure of philosophical greatness, not whether you got everything right, but whether you ask questions so profound and developed frameworks so powerful that subsequent thinkers must continue to engage with your work, whether to build upon it, modify it, or argue against it. By this measure, Aristotle stands among the very greatest philosophers in human history. His legacy is not a fixed system to be preserved unchanged, but a living tradition of inquiry that continues to evolve. Each generation reinterprets Aristotle in light of its own concerns and knowledge, finding new insights and applications. This ongoing engagement testifies to the depth and richness of his thought. As we face contemporary challenges, ethical dilemmas raised by technology, questions about human nature and enhancement, debates about politics and community, puzzles about consciousness and mind, Aristotelian resources remain relevant, not as final answers, but as sophisticated starting points, as illuminating perspectives, as reminders of complexity and nuance. The complete philosophy of Aristotle, in all its breadth and depth, continues to offer wisdom for those willing to engage seriously with this towering intellect. His voice still speaks across the centuries, challenging us to think more carefully, observe more attentively, integrate more comprehensively, and live more excellently. This is the gift he gave humanity, and it remains as valuable today as it was in ancient Athens.